The frozen air bit through Penelope Dawson's wool coat like knives as she stumbled through the blinding white curtain of snow that had descended upon Taylorsville, Utah without warning. She had left her father's general store only 20 minutes earlier to deliver medicine to the Henderson family 3 miles north, confident she could make the journey before the weather turned. But winter in 1883 was merciless and unpredictable. Now she could barely see her gloved hand in front of her face, and the familiar landmarks that should have guided her home had vanished beneath the howling storm. Her horse had bolted 10 minutes ago when lightning cracked across the gray sky, leaving her alone and disoriented in a landscape that had transformed into a white void. She pressed forward, each step requiring more effort than the last, her boots sinking deep into snow that seemed to multiply with every passing moment. The ground disappeared beneath her so suddenly that she did not even have time to scream. One moment she was struggling through knee-deep snow, and the next she was falling through darkness, her arms flailing uselessly as she plummeted downward. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and pain exploded through her left ankle as she crumpled onto the frozen earth at the bottom of what she quickly realized was an abandoned well. The opening above her was a small circle of gray light, already being obscured by the relentless snowfall. She tried to stand, but her ankle gave way immediately, sending fresh waves of agony up her leg. The walls around her were smooth stone, slick with ice, impossible to climb even if both her legs had been working properly. The well was perhaps 15 feet deep, deep enough that no amount of jumping would bring her within reach of the top, and narrow enough that the wind howling above created an eerie whistling sound as it passed over the opening. Penelope fought down the panic rising in her throat and forced herself to think clearly. She was 22 years old, the eldest daughter of Samuel Dawson, and she had not survived 2 harsh Utah winters and helped run a successful business by giving in to fear. But as the minutes stretched on and the temperature continued to drop, even her determined spirit began to waver. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and huddled against the least icy section of wall, knowing that hypothermia would claim her long before anyone realized she was missing. Her father would not expect her back until after supper, and in this blizzard no one would venture out to search until morning at the earliest. By then it would be too late. She did not know how long she sat there, shivering and trying to conserve what little warmth remained in her body, when she heard it. At first she thought the wind was playing tricks on her frozen mind, but then the sound came again, clearer this time. Hoofbeats. Someone was riding through the blizzard, and they were close. Penelope summoned every ounce of strength she had left and screamed for help, her voice cracking from cold and fear but carrying upward through the narrow shaft of the well. The hoofbeats stopped. She screamed again, louder this time, and then held her breath, listening desperately for any sign that she had been heard. A shadow fell across the opening above, blocking out what little light remained, and then a man's face appeared, barely visible through the swirling snow. "Hello down there. Are you hurt?" The voice was deep and steady, carrying a note of concern that made something in Penelope's chest unclench slightly. "My ankle is injured," she called back, hating how weak and shaky her voice sounded. "I cannot climb out on my own." The face disappeared for a moment, and Penelope felt a fresh surge of panic that he might leave, but then he was back. "I am going to lower a rope. Can you tie it around yourself under your arms? I will pull you up, but you need to hold on tight and try to use your good leg to help walk yourself up the wall if you can." "Yes," Penelope said, relief flooding through her so intensely that tears pricked at her eyes. Thank you so much." The rope came snaking down through the opening, and Penelope grabbed it with trembling fingers that barely seemed to function anymore. It took her 3 attempts to tie the knot properly, her hands clumsy from cold and pain, but finally she managed it, securing the rope beneath her arms as instructed. "I am ready," she called up. "Hold on tight now," the man's voice came back. "I have got you." The rope went taut, and then Penelope was rising, her body scraping against the icy wall as she ascended, True to the stranger's instructions, she tried to use her good leg to help, pushing off the wall when she could find purchase, but mostly she just held on with all her remaining strength and let him pull her upward. It seemed to take forever, though it could not have been more than a minute, and then hands were gripping her arms, hauling her over the lip of the well and onto solid ground. She collapsed into the snow, gasping and shaking, and the man knelt beside her. "Easy now, easy. You are safe. Let me look at that ankle." His hands were gentle but competent as he examined her injury through her boot, and Penelope got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by snow and striking blue-gray eyes that studied her with genuine concern. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with lines around his eyes and a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. He wore the typical attire of a working cowboy, durable clothes meant for long days in the saddle, and a worn leather coat that had seen many seasons. "I think it is badly sprained but not broken," he said after a moment. "But we need to get you somewhere warm immediately. Can you ride if I help you?" "I think so," Penelope managed through chattering teeth. "My name is Archer Northwood," he said as he carefully lifted her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. "I have a line cabin about a mile from here. It is not much, but it has a stove and walls, which is more than we have got out here. My horse can carry us both that far." "Penelope Dawson," she replied, gasping as pain shot through her ankle even though she was not putting weight on it. "From Taylorsville. I was trying to deliver medicine when the storm hit." Archer's expression darkened with worry. "This storm came up fast. I was checking the fence lines on the northern range when it hit. Lucky I was heading back to the cabin or I never would have heard you." He did not say what they both knew, that she would have died in that well if he had taken a different route. The thought hung between them, unspoken but heavy with meaning. Getting onto the horse was an ordeal that left Penelope breathless with pain, but Archer was patient and careful, and finally she was settled in the saddle with him behind her, his arms bracketing her body as he held the reins. She leaned back against his chest, too cold and exhausted to care about propriety, and felt his warmth seeping through their layers of clothing. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, moved forward at a steady walk through the deepening snow. The ride to the cabin seemed both endless and over too quickly. Penelope drifted in a haze of cold and pain, aware of Archer's solid presence behind her and the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them, but little else. When they finally stopped, she barely registered that they had arrived until Archer was lifting her down, carrying her in his arms like she weighed nothing. The cabin door opened, and then they were inside, out of the wind and snow, and Archer was lowering her carefully onto a narrow cot against one wall. "I need to get a fire going," he said, already moving toward the small iron stove in the corner. "Then I will take a look at that ankle properly and see about getting you warm." Penelope watched through heavy-lidded eyes as he worked quickly and efficiently, stuffing kindling and logs into the stove and coaxing them to life with practiced ease. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, and warmth began to spread through the small space. The cabin was exactly what he had said it was, not much but functional. One room with the stove, the cot, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding supplies. Typical line cabin, meant to house ranch hands checking remote sections of fence during the grazing season. But right now, with the storm raging outside and heat beginning to fill the space, it seemed like the most wonderful place Penelope had ever been. Archer returned to her side with a tin cup full of water from a barrel near the door. "Drink this slowly," he instructed. "Then I'm going to need to remove your boot to examine your ankle properly. It is going to hurt." He was not wrong. Even with Archer's careful handling, removing her boot sent such sharp pain through her ankle that Penelope had to bite down on her lip to keep from crying out. When the boot finally came free, her ankle was already swollen and beginning to bruise, turning an ugly purple-black color that made Archer wince in sympathy. "Definitely sprained," he confirmed. "I am going to wrap it, and you need to keep it elevated and stay off it as much as possible. In this storm, we are not going anywhere for at least a day or two anyway." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in through Penelope's haze of exhaustion. She was going to be trapped in this tiny cabin with a strange man for the duration of the blizzard. Her reputation would be ruined if anyone found out. But the alternative had been freezing to death at the bottom of a well, and she found she was remarkably unconcerned about propriety when the choice was between scandal and death. "My father will be worried sick," she said quietly. "I'm sure he will be," Archer agreed, his tone sympathetic as he began wrapping her ankle with strips of cloth he produced from a supply box. "But Samuel Dawson is a sensible man. He will know that no one could travel in this storm, and he will trust that you found shelter somewhere. When the weather clears, I will ride into town immediately and let him know you are safe." Penelope blinked in surprise. "You know my father?" "Everyone in these parts knows Samuel Dawson," Archer said with a slight smile. "I work for the Double Bar Ranch. We get our supplies from your father's store. I've seen you there a few times, though we were never properly introduced." Now that he mentioned it, Penelope thought she might have noticed him among the cowboys who came through the store periodically. The Double Bar was one of the larger ranches in the area, sprawling across several thousand acres of grazing land north of Taylorsville. "Then you know he will probably shoot you when we get back to town," she said, attempting humor despite the seriousness of their situation. Archer's smile widened, reaching his eyes and transforming his weathered face into something almost handsome. "I reckon saving his daughter's life might buy me a little goodwill. But I understand his position. I've got 2 younger sisters back in Wyoming. If either of them ended up spending a few days alone in a cabin with a strange man, I would want to shoot him too, circumstances be damned." Penelope found herself smiling back despite everything. There was something inherently trustworthy about Archer Northwood, a solid steadiness that put her at ease even in this bizarre and potentially scandalous situation. "Well, since we are going to be stuck here together, you should probably tell me more about yourself." "Wyoming, you said? What brings you to Utah?" As the storm continued to rage outside and the cabin gradually warmed, Archer settled into the other chair and began to talk. He told her about growing up on a small ranch near Laramie, the youngest of 3 siblings and the only son. His father had died 5 years ago, and the ranch had gone to his eldest sister's husband. Rather than stay on as a hired hand on what had once been his family's land, Archer had struck out on his own, working his way south through Wyoming and into Utah, taking jobs on various ranches and learning the trade from the ground up. He had been with the Double Bar for almost 2 years now, working as a regular ranch hand but hoping to eventually save enough to buy a small piece of land of his own. "Nothing fancy," he said, his eyes distant as he spoke of his dreams. "Just enough for a decent herd and a house that does not leak when it rains, maybe near a good water source, build something that is mine, you know?" Penelope did know. She understood that desire to create something lasting, something that belonged to you alone. It was why she loved helping him run her father's store, why she took such pride in keeping the inventory organized and the customers satisfied. "That sounds like a good dream," she said softly. Archer's gaze refocused on her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "What about you, Miss Dawson? What are your dreams?" No one had ever asked her that before. Men in Taylorsville assumed she would marry eventually, probably to some local rancher or merchant, and that would be that. Her own desires had never seemed particularly relevant, but sitting in this cabin with this stranger who had pulled her from certain death, Penelope found herself answering honestly. "I want to expand the store. My father is content with what we have, but I think we could do more. Bring in more variety of goods, maybe even start a mail-order catalog service for the more remote ranches. And I want to learn about medicine, not to be a doctor necessarily, but to know enough to help people when the actual doctor is too far away or too expensive." Archer nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You were delivering medicine when you got caught in the storm. You do that often?" "When I can," Penelope confirmed. "Dr. Murray charges fees that some families cannot afford, and he is not always available for minor ailments. I have been studying his books when he lets me, learning what I can. Nothing serious, just basic remedies and first aid mostly, but it helps people." "That is admirable," Archer said, and he sounded like he genuinely meant it. "You have got a good heart, Miss Dawson." "Call me Penelope," she said impulsively. "I think we can dispense with formalities given the circumstances." "Penelope," Archer repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. "Then you should call me Archer." As the afternoon wore into evening, they continued to talk. Archer prepared a simple meal from the cabin's supplies, salt pork and beans with hardtack softened in the pan drippings, and Penelope discovered she was ravenously hungry despite everything. Or perhaps because of everything. Nearly dying apparently gave one quite an appetite. They ate sitting by the stove, and the conversation flowed easily between them, ranging from the serious to the mundane. Archer told stories about life on the ranch, about ornery cattle and difficult river crossings and the harsh beauty of the open range. Penelope shared stories about the store, about the eccentric customers, and the constant challenge of keeping inventory when shipments were delayed by weather or broken wagon wheels. It was only when full darkness had fallen and the temperature in the cabin began to drop despite the stove that they confronted the practical reality of their sleeping arrangements. There was only one cot and one blanket, and while the fire helped, it was not enough to keep the cold completely at bay. Archer cleared his throat awkwardly. "You take the cot and the blanket. I will sleep on the floor near the stove. I have weathered worse." "Archer, that is ridiculous," Penelope said firmly. "You will freeze. And after you saved my life, I am not going to let you sleep on the cold floor while I take the only bed." "Your ankle needs rest," Archer countered, "and you nearly died from exposure already today. You need the cot more than I do." They argued for several more minutes before Penelope finally made a practical suggestion that made them both uncomfortable, but was clearly the only sensible solution. "The cot is narrow but wide enough for two people if we are pressed close together. We can share the blanket and use each other's body heat to stay warm. It is purely practical." Archer looked torn between propriety and common sense. Finally, common sense won. "Are you certain?" "I am certain that I do not want to be responsible for you catching pneumonia," Penelope said firmly, "and I am certain that we are both adults who can handle an uncomfortable situation with maturity. You saved my life today, Archer. I trust you." Those last 4 words seemed to settle something in Archer's expression. He nodded once decisively. "All right, but I am sleeping on the outside edge, and you keep your injured ankle toward the wall where it is safe." They arranged themselves on the cot with careful awkwardness, Penelope lying on her good side facing the wall, Archer behind her with barely an inch of space between their bodies. The blanket covered them both, and despite the strangeness of the situation, Penelope had to admit that his warmth at her back felt wonderful. She could feel his breath stirring her hair, feel the solid presence of him behind her, and instead of feeling threatened, she felt safe. "Thank you again," she whispered into the darkness, "for everything." "No need for thanks," Archer replied softly. "I am just glad I was in the right place at the right time." Despite the discomfort of her ankle and the strangeness of her circumstances, Penelope fell asleep surprisingly quickly, lulled by the warmth and the steady rhythm of Archer's breathing behind her. She woke sometime in the night to find that they had shifted in their sleep. She was pressed fully against Archer now, his arm draped over her waist, her back tucked against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat against her spine, slow and steady. She knew she should move away, re-establish some distance, but she was warm and comfortable, and she felt safe in a way she had never experienced before. Instead of pulling away, she let herself drift back to sleep. Morning brought clearer weather, but not much. The blizzard had lessened to steady snowfall. Still too heavy for safe travel, but no longer the white-out conditions of the previous day. Archer woke first and carefully extricated himself from the cot without waking Penelope, then got the fire going strong again and prepared breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon finally roused her, and she blinked awake to find him standing by the stove, his back to her as he cooked. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. He turned and smiled at her. and Penelope felt her heart do a strange little flip in her chest. "Morning. How is the ankle?" "Hurts," she admitted, "but better than yesterday. At least, the swelling seems to have stopped getting worse." They ate breakfast together, and the conversation came even more easily than it had the day before. The awkwardness of sharing the cot seemed to have broken down some invisible barrier between them, and Penelope found herself telling Archer things she had never told anyone. About how her mother had died when Penelope was 16, leaving her to help raise her 3 younger siblings while also helping her father run the store. About how she sometimes felt trapped by all the responsibilities and expectations, even though she loved her family dearly. About how she wanted more from life but was not entirely sure what the more looked like. Archer listened with his full attention, never interrupting. His gray-blue eyes focused on her face in a way that made her feel truly heard. When she finally trailed off, embarrassed by how much she had revealed, he did not make light of her feelings or try to tell her they did not matter. "I think wanting more is natural," he said quietly, "and I think you are one of the strongest people I have ever met, Penelope. Most women in your position would have given up or given in a long time ago, but you are still fighting for what you want, still dreaming. That takes courage." No one had ever called her courageous before. Dutiful, yes. Responsible, certainly. Hardworking and practical and sensible, but never courageous. The word wrapped around her heart and squeezed, and she had to blink back sudden tears. The day passed slowly, but not unpleasantly. Archer ventured outside periodically to check on his horse and bring in more wood for the fire. Penelope rested her ankle and read aloud from the single book in the cabin's supplies, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that some previous occupant had left behind. Archer admitted he had little education in literature, so Penelope found herself explaining the meaning behind the verses and was surprised by how much he engaged with the poetry once he understood it. "Listen to this one," she said, flipping to Sonnet 116. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." "What does that mean exactly?" Archer asked, genuinely curious. "It means that true love does not change just because circumstances change," Penelope explained. "That real love persists through difficulties and challenges, that it is constant and unwavering." Archer was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Do you believe that? That kind of love exists?" "I want to," Penelope said honestly. "I've never seen it myself, not really. My parents loved each other, I think, but it was more of a practical partnership than anything else. But I want to believe that kind of deep, unwavering love is possible." "Me too," Archer said softly, and when his eyes met hers, there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. That night, they shared the cot again with far less awkwardness. Penelope settled into the curve of Archer's body like it was the most natural thing in the world, and when his arm came around her waist, she placed her hand over his and held it there. Neither of them spoke about what was happening between them, the connection that was forming faster than should have been possible, but it was there, undeniable and growing stronger with each passing hour. The 3rd day dawned clear and cold, the storm finally blown out. Archer stood at the cabin's single window, looking out at a transformed landscape buried under more than 2 feet of snow. "It is clear enough to travel now," he said, but there was something reluctant in his voice. "We should head back to town. Your father will be worried sick, and the longer we wait, the harder this will be to explain." Penelope knew he was right, but her heart sank at the thought of leaving this small cabin and returning to real life. Here, in this tiny space cut off from the world, she had found something precious. She had found someone who listened to her, who saw her as more than just Samuel Dawson's capable daughter. She had found someone who made her laugh, and made her think, and made her feel things she had not known she was capable of feeling. "You are right," she said quietly. We should go." The journey back to Taylorsville was slow and difficult through the deep snow, with Penelope riding in front of Archer on his horse just as she had on the way to the cabin. But this time, instead of being barely conscious from cold and pain, she was acutely aware of every point of contact between them. his arms around her, his chest against her back. The way he held her just a little bit tighter than was strictly necessary. They did not talk much during the ride. There was too much to say and no way to say it. Not yet. Not until they faced what awaited them in town. As they expected, their arrival caused quite a stir. Samuel Dawson came running from the store the moment he spotted them. His face and mixture of relief and anger and worry. "Penelope, thank God! We have been searching everywhere. Where have you been?" Before Penelope could answer, Archer was helping her down from the horse, careful of her injured ankle. "Mr. Dawson, your daughter fell into an abandoned well during the blizzard. I found her and took her to the nearest shelter, which was the line cabin on the Double Bar's north range. Her ankle is badly sprained, but nothing is broken. She was safe, and I promise you I conducted myself as a gentleman at all times." Samuel's eyes darted between them, taking in Penelope's disheveled appearance and Archer's protective stance. The line cabin? Alone? For 3 days? "It was that or let her freeze to death," Archer said bluntly. "I made the only choice I could make, sir. And if you need to blame someone for any scandal, blame me. Your daughter did nothing wrong." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Penelope could see the speculation in their eyes, the whispers already starting. She lifted her chin defiantly. "Archer Northwood saved my life, Father. I fell into a well in the middle of a blizzard, and I would have died if he had not found me. Everything else is secondary to that fact." Samuel's expression softened as he looked at his daughter, taking in her injured ankle and the shadows under her eyes. "We will talk about this at home," he said finally. Then he extended his hand to Archer. "Thank you for saving my daughter's life. I am in your debt." Archer shook his hand firmly. "No debt, sir. Anyone would have done the same." But as his eyes met Penelope's over her father's shoulder, they both knew that was not true. What had happened between them in that cabin went far beyond simple rescue. Something had begun in those 3 days, something neither of them could easily walk away from. The next few days were difficult. Penelope was confined to the house, her ankles still healing and her father keeping a close watch on her. The gossip in town was vicious, with plenty of speculation about what had really happened in that line cabin. More than one person suggested that Archer had compromised her and should be forced to marry her to make things right. Penelope hated every word of it. Hated that something innocent was being twisted into scandal, hated that Archer's heroism was being repaid with suspicion and innuendo. But what bothered her most was that she had not seen Archer since they returned to town. He had not come by the store or sent word. She told herself he was just being careful, not wanting to make the gossip worse, but doubt crept in during the long, boring hours of forced rest. Had she imagined the connection between them? Had those moments of intimacy in the cabin meant something different to him than they had to her? It was a full week after their return, her ankle finally strong enough to walk on with only a slight limp, when there was a knock on the door of the family's living quarters above the store. Penelope's younger sister Emma answered it, then came running to find her. "Penelope, there is a man here to see you. The cowboy." Penelope's heart leaped into her throat. She smoothed her hair and her skirts, suddenly nervous, and made her way to the door. Archer stood there, hat in hand, looking scrubbed clean and wearing what were clearly his best clothes. He looked nervous too, which was oddly reassuring. "Miss Dawson," he said formally, "I was wondering if I might speak with you and your father." "Of course," Penelope managed, stepping back to let him in. She called for her father, who emerged from the store looking suspicious and protective. "Mr. Dawson," Archer began, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders, "I have come to ask permission to court your daughter, properly and publicly." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir. I know the circumstances of how we met were unusual, and I know there has been talk, but I want you to know that my intentions are completely honorable. I have been in this area for 2 years now, working steadily for the Double Bar. I have saved most of my wages, and I am in the process of negotiating to buy a section of land just west of here, with a good water source. I am not rich, but I am a hard worker, and I will be able to provide for a family. And more importantly, I think your daughter is the most remarkable woman I have ever met. I would like the chance to get to know her better with your blessing and under respectable circumstances." Penelope held her breath, her eyes fixed on her father's face. Samuel looked at Archer for a long moment, then at his daughter, and whatever he saw in her expression seemed to decide him. "You may court her," he said slowly, "with the understanding that she makes her own decisions about her future. I will not force her to marry anyone, regardless of any gossip. But if you hurt her or treat her with anything less than complete respect, you will answer to me. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," Archer said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you." Samuel nodded and returned to the store, leaving them alone in the doorway. Archer turned to Penelope, his expression softening. "I am sorry I stayed away so long. I wanted to come sooner, but I needed to make sure I had something real to offer you, not just pretty words. I have been working on the land deal every day this week, and it is almost finalized. Penelope, I know we barely know each other in the conventional sense, but those 3 days in the cabin, I felt like I got to know the real you. And I want to keep knowing you for the rest of my life if you will let me." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. "I felt the same way," she admitted. "I have been miserable all week, thinking maybe I had imagined it all." "You did not imagine anything," Archer said firmly. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "So what do you say? Will you let me court you properly? Dinners and walks and all the respectable things courting couples do?" "Yes," Penelope said, smiling through her tears. "Yes, absolutely. Yes." The courtship that followed was everything traditional and proper that their first 3 days together had not been. Archer came to Sunday dinners with the family, sat through Emma's piano recitals, and helped Penelope's younger brothers with their schoolwork. He took Penelope on chaperoned walks through town and to church socials and community dances. He was polite and respectful, and everything a proper suitor should be. But there were also stolen moments that reminded them both of the intimacy they had shared in the line cabin. The way his hand would linger on hers just a bit too long when he helped her into the wagon. The private smiles they exchanged across crowded rooms. The conversations that stretched late into the evening, long after propriety suggested he should have gone home. Talking about everything and nothing until Penelope's father had to pointedly clear his throat and remind them of the hour. 6 months into their courtship, on a warm summer evening in 1884, Archer took Penelope for a ride out to the land he had purchased. It was beautiful property, rolling grassland with a clear stream running through it and a grove of cottonwood trees providing shade. "I want to build the house right there," Archer said, pointing to a slight rise that would provide a good view in all directions. "Nothing too fancy to start, just 4 rooms, but solid and well-built, a place we can grow into." Penelope noticed his use of "we," but did not comment on it, just smiled and let him continue. "I have been working on plans," Archer went on, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Kitchen here, parlor here, 2 bedrooms here and here. But I was thinking, maybe we could add on a small room at the back, kind of a workroom. Somewhere you could keep medical supplies and books, maybe even see patients if people need help. I know that is important to you." Penelope stared at the rough sketch, then at Archer's face, and felt her heart overflow with love. He had been listening, not just in the cabin during those 3 intense days, but during all the months since. He had heard her dreams, and he was trying to make space for them in the life he was planning. "Archer," she said softly. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Penelope, I have been patient and proper for 6 months now. I have courted you the right way and given everyone in town time to see that we are serious about each other. But I cannot wait any longer to ask you what I have wanted to ask since the day we left that cabin. Will you marry me? Will you build this life with me? I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy and to support your dreams, not just my own. I love you, Penelope. I think I have loved you since I first looked down into that well and saw you looking back up at me." "Yes," Penelope said, tears streaming down her face now. Yes, I will marry you. I love you too, Archer. So much it scares me sometimes. He kissed her then, properly for the first time, and it was everything she had imagined during those long months of proper courtship. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning, Archer rested his forehead against hers. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this, he promised. I know you will, Penelope said, because I am going to spend the rest of mine doing the same thing. They were married in October of 1884, in a simple ceremony at the church in Taylorsville, with the whole town in attendance. Despite the gossip that had surrounded their initial meeting, or perhaps because of it, everyone wanted to witness the union of the cowboy and the store owner's daughter who had found love in the most unlikely of circumstances. Penelope wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her by Emma's careful hands, and carried wildflowers from the meadow on Archer's property. Archer wore a new suit bought special for the occasion, and when he saw Penelope walking down the aisle toward him, his eyes grew suspiciously bright. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but when Archer said, "I do," Penelope heard all the promises he had made to her in private, to support her dreams, to build a life together based on partnership and mutual respect, to love her not in spite of her strength and independence, but because of it. They moved into the house Archer had built on his land, and it was exactly as he had described it. 4 solid rooms with good bones, and the small workroom at the back that he had designed specifically for Penelope's medical interests. She set it up with shelves for supplies and books, a work table, and a comfortable chair for patients. Within months, people from surrounding ranches were stopping by for basic medical care, grateful for an alternative to the expensive doctor in town. Penelope never charged for her services, but grateful patients paid in other ways. With fresh eggs or vegetables from their gardens or help with chores, Archer's ranch prospered too. He started small with just 20 head of cattle, but he was a skilled rancher and a careful manager of resources. Within 2 years, his herd had doubled, and he was able to hire occasional help during busy seasons. He and Penelope worked side by side, combining their strengths. She managed the business side of things, keeping accounts and negotiating sales, while he handled the day-to-day operation of the ranch. But more than their individual successes, their marriage itself was a success. They maintained the closeness they had found in that line cabin, the ability to talk for hours about everything and nothing, the deep sense of partnership and mutual support. They argued sometimes because both had strong opinions and stubborn streaks, but they always worked through their disagreements with respect and communication. Their first child, a son they named Andrew, was born in the spring of 1886. Penelope labored through the night, attended by a midwife from town, with Archer pacing anxiously outside. When he was finally allowed in to meet his son, he cradled the tiny bundle with such tenderness that Penelope fell in love with him all over again. "He is perfect," Archer whispered, tears running unashamedly down his face. "You are perfect. Thank you." Andrew was followed by a daughter, Margaret, 2 years later, and then another son, Thomas, 2 years after that. The house that had seemed plenty large for 2 people began to feel cramped, with 3 children running through it. So Archer added on, building a second story with 3 bedrooms and expanding the kitchen to accommodate their growing family. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when the cattle struggled and money was tight. There was the year drought threatened to dry up their creek, and they had to drive the herd 10 miles to find adequate water. There was the influenza outbreak of 1889 that claimed the lives of several neighbors and had Penelope working around the clock to care for the sick, including her own children who thankfully recovered. But through all of it, Archer and Penelope faced every challenge together. He never complained when she spent long hours caring for sick neighbors. She never complained when ranch emergencies kept him away from home for days at a time. They had built their marriage on a foundation of trust and partnership, and that foundation held firm through every storm. On a cold winter evening in 1893, 10 years after Penelope had fallen into that well, They sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching their 3 children play in the snow. Andrew, now 7, was helping his younger siblings build a snowman, his serious face so much like his father's that it made Penelope smile. "Do you ever think about that day?" Archer asked quietly, reaching over to take Penelope's hand. "When I found you in the well?" "All the time," Penelope admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if you had not been riding that particular path, if you had not heard me calling, if you had decided it was too much trouble to help a stranger in a storm." "I would have helped you regardless," Archer said. "But I am not going to lie and say I did not know even then that you were going to be important to me. When I looked down into that well and saw your face, something just clicked into place inside me, like I had been waiting my whole life to find you and did not even know it." "I felt the same way," Penelope said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Even scared and hurt and half frozen, I looked up and saw you and thought, this is someone I could trust. Someone good." "You know what Emma told me the other day?" Archer said, amusement in his voice. "She said that falling into that well was the best thing that ever happened to you. I am not sure if I should be flattered or offended on your behalf." Penelope laughed. "She is not entirely wrong. Obviously, I wish it had happened differently, without the terror and pain and potential death. But that experience led me to you, and to this life we have built together. So yes, in a roundabout way, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me." "I am the lucky one," Archer said, pulling her closer. "I got to be the one to pull you up. I got to be the one you trusted, and I get to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night, just like that first night in the line cabin, except now I do not have to worry about being proper and respectable." "Archer Northwood," Penelope said, laughing and swatting his arm. "The children are completely absorbed in their snowman," Archer pointed out. "And I am just saying what is true. I love you, Penelope, more today than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is how it works with us." "Unwavering love that persists through difficulties and challenges," Penelope quoted softly, remembering the Shakespeare sonnet they had read together in the cabin all those years ago. "Constant and unchanging. You gave me that kind of love, Archer." "We gave it to each other," Archer corrected, kissing the top of her head. "That is what makes it real." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Their children's laughter rang out in the cold air, and smoke curled from the chimney of the house they had built together. Inside, dinner was waiting, the house warm and welcoming. As the years continued to pass, the ranch grew more prosperous and their family grew closer. Andrew showed an aptitude for ranching and began working alongside his father as soon as he was old enough. Margaret inherited her mother's interest in healing and began accompanying Penelope on her medical visits to neighbors. Thomas, the youngest, turned out to have a head for business and began helping manage the ranch's accounts while still in his teens. Penelope's medical practice, though always unofficial and unpaid, became an invaluable resource for the community. She delivered babies, set broken bones, treated fevers and infections, and sat with the dying when there was no more she could do. Dr. Murray, rather than being threatened by her work, began referring patients to her for basic care and sought her assistance with difficult cases. They developed a professional relationship built on mutual respect, and he eventually donated many of his old medical texts to her library. Archer became a respected figure in the ranching community, known for his integrity and his skill with cattle. He was elected to serve on the local Cattlemen's Association board and helped mediate disputes between neighboring ranchers. But despite his growing reputation and the success of his ranch, he never lost sight of what mattered most. His family always came first. Their children grew and thrived. Andrew married Sarah, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, in 1904 and built a house on the far end of Archer and Penelope's property. They had 4 children of their own, and Andrew eventually took over the day-to-day operation of the ranch as Archer grew older. Margaret married a young doctor who moved to Taylorsville in 1906, and they opened a proper medical practice in town together. Penelope worked with them often and finally had her medical knowledge formally recognized when Margaret's husband listed her as a consulting physician at the practice. Thomas went to university in Salt Lake City, the first of their family to receive formal higher education, and returned with a degree in business. He helped modernize the ranch's operations and eventually started a successful freight company that served the ranches and towns throughout the region. On a warm spring day in 1913, Archer and Penelope celebrated their 30 years of marriage surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and friends. The party was held at the ranch with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and food enough to feed half the county. As the afternoon wore on and the festivities continued around them, Archer led Penelope away for a walk, following the creek that ran through their property. 30 years, he said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I was lowering that rope down to you. Other times it feels like we have been together forever. Both can be true, Penelope said, her hand comfortably tucked into the crook of his arm. They were both in their 50s now, their hair shot through with gray, and their faces marked by the passage of time. But when Archer looked at Penelope, he still saw the brave young woman who had looked up at him from the bottom of that well. And when Penelope looked at Archer, she still saw the steady, kind man who had risked himself to save a stranger. I would do it all again, Archer said. Every hard winter, every difficult calving season, every moment of worry when you were out caring for sick patients and I was afraid you would catch whatever they had. I would do it all again exactly the same because it brought me here, to this moment with you. I feel the same way, Penelope said. She stopped walking and turned to face him fully, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. You saved my life that day in more ways than one, Archer. You gave me a life worth living, full of love and purpose and partnership. You gave me everything I dreamed of and so much more I had not even known to dream about. Archer pulled her close, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, because to him she was. We saved each other, he said softly. That is the truth of it. We fell in love in a blizzard, and we have been keeping each other warm ever since. They stood there by the creek, in the shade of the cottonwoods, holding each other as the sounds of celebration drifted across the meadow. Their children and grandchildren, the family they had built together, the ranch they had created from nothing but hard work and determination, the community they had served for 3 decades. It was a good life, a full life, the kind of life that seemed impossible from the bottom of a well in a blizzard. As they walked back to join their family, Penelope glanced up at the clear blue sky and silently sent up a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for the storm that had stranded her. Gratitude for the abandoned well she had fallen into. Gratitude for the cowboy with kind eyes who had lowered a rope and pulled her up, not just out of that well, but into a life beyond her wildest dreams. Years continued to pass in the comfortable rhythm of life well lived. Archer and Penelope grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing like fine wine. They became the patriarchs of a sprawling family, dispensing advice and wisdom to children and grandchildren who sought them out not just for their experience, but for the example they set of what a true partnership looked like. In the spring of 1923, 40 years after that fateful blizzard, Penelope fell ill with pneumonia. Despite Margaret's best medical care and Archer's constant vigil, she grew weaker. On a quiet morning in May, surrounded by her family, Penelope passed away peacefully, holding Archer's hand just as she had held it on that first night in the line cabin. Archer grieved deeply, but not bitterly. He had been blessed with 40 years of marriage to the most remarkable woman he had ever known. They had built a life together, raised 3 wonderful children, seen those children marry and have children of their own. He had loved her and been loved by her in return, and that was more than most people ever got. He lived for another 3 years, staying active on the ranch and spending time with his ever-growing family. He never remarried. When asked why, he simply said that he had already found his love, his partner, his other half. Some people only got one great love in their lifetime, and Penelope had been his. On a winter evening in 1926, Archer passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 68. He was buried next to Penelope in the cemetery at Taylorsville, under a stone that read simply, "Together Again." At the funeral, Andrew spoke about his parents' love story, about how his father had saved his mother from an abandoned well during a blizzard, and how that single act of heroism had sparked a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. He talked about the values they had instilled in their children, about partnership and respect and unwavering support. He talked about how they had faced every challenge together and celebrated every triumph together, never losing sight of what truly mattered. As the family gathered at the ranch after the service, Margaret found an old notebook of her mother's, a journal Penelope had kept sporadically over the years. In it, she found an entry from their 30th wedding anniversary. "Today, Archer and I celebrated 30 years of marriage. Sometimes I still cannot believe that the terrified girl who fell into that well grew up to have this beautiful life. When I was down in that darkness, cold and afraid and certain I was going to die, I could not have imagined that rescue would come in the form of love itself. But that is what Archer has been to me. Not just my rescuer, but my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. He pulled me up from that well, and he has been pulling me up ever since whenever life tries to drag me down. And I have done the same for him. That is what love is, I think. Taking turns pulling each other up when the world gets too heavy, being each other's rope, each other's anchor, each other's safe harbor in the storm. I have been blessed beyond measure. I have been loved beyond reason, and I have loved in return with every fiber of my being. When I die, whether that is tomorrow or 40 years from now, I will die knowing that I lived fully and loved completely. What more could anyone ask for?" Margaret shared the passage with her brothers, and they all wept together, not just from grief, but from gratitude. Their parents had given them such a gift, not just in the life they had provided, but in the example they had set. True love, the kind that persisted through difficulties and challenges, the kind that was constant and unwavering, was real. They had seen it, lived in its presence, been shaped by its power. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation Archers and Penelope had built. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original 4 rooms and the medical workroom were always preserved, kept as a memorial to the couple who had started it all. The story of how Archer and Penelope met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. The abandoned well where Penelope had fallen was eventually located and marked with a stone plaque that read, "Where Love Began, 1883. It became a tradition for newlyweds in the family to visit the site, to remember that sometimes the darkest, most frightening moments can lead to the greatest blessings. And so the legacy of a cowboy and a store owner's daughter lived on, not just in the land they had claimed and the family they had created, but in the example they had set. That love was not just a feeling, but a choice, made every day, through good times and bad. That partnership meant supporting each other's dreams, not just your own. That trust, once earned, could form the foundation of a lifetime of happiness. In the end, their love story was not remarkable because it started dramatically with a rescue in a blizzard. It was remarkable because it endured, growing stronger with each passing year, weathering every storm life threw at them, and leaving behind a legacy of love that touched everyone who knew them. They had fallen in love in the Wild West in a time and place where life was hard and survival was never guaranteed, but they had found something more valuable than gold or land or any material wealth. They had found each other, and that had made all the difference.